put in properly the amount of work that he has done. I want to thank Avi Garson also for all of his dedication. Of course, the Montefiore Endowment and the S&P and Dangor Education and all of the people who were involved with that, which also took a good deal of effort and work, but we're very grateful for all of that work that has been done. And may it be, Yehi Ratzon, that all of it should emerge into blessing, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it should find favor in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's eyes, and we should be zocheh to study Torah. I want to, before I begin, I know that all of us, I'm sure that all of us have had half of our hearts, if not more, occupied on what's going on in Eretz Israel. And so I am saying these short divrei Torah that I want to share with you as an opening to Professor Zohar's very interesting shiur. He's speaking on Israel Moshe Hazan, is that right? Right? Which is, I mean, what a figure. It would be Israel Moshe Hazan is, a towering figure in our recent history. And so I'm so excited for you to be able to learn from Professor Zohar tonight about him and about his thought. But we certainly want to we're keeping our minds on what's going on in the Eretz Hemda, in the Eretz Kodesh. And so I want to say these words as a dedication to all of Ahenu Bet Israel that are in Eretz Israel, and that Hakadosh Baruch Hu should protect them and watch over them and bring peace to the Aretz and to our nation. I'm only speaking shortly, and therefore I only have a very short idea. But this idea, this concept, I believe, is the core of what it is that we are aiming to do with the Habura, and that is very simply that the Habura is not about information. It is not about data. It is about framework. And there is a huge difference between the two. Now, of course, you will learn a great deal of data. But this is data that if you really wanted to, you can learn by opening the books and listening to lessons and so on by many of the people that we are very grateful and honored to be able to have teach on this platform. It may take a bit more effort on your part, but we would be very happy to recommend books and to recommend lectures and so on. You go ahead and do that. This is not just a platform of convenience. There is something more that comes by being engaged with this virtual and in various places and situations, physical Bet Midrash. And that is this. If you spend your time and you dedicate yourself to learning and listening to what is being offered here at the Habura, you will not just gain information and data, you will gain a lens through which to see the entire Torah and Judaism. You will gain a framework through which you will be able to understand and interpret all of the data points that you will ever learn. And if you are here, even though you may not be able to articulate it, or you may not have thought to articulate it, maybe you have, it is essentially what it is that you're looking for, I would imagine. What you're looking for is an understanding of what it means to be a thinker in the perspective of what we are calling classical Sfarad. What was the way that Harambam saw the Torah? What was the way that Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan saw the Torah? What was the way that Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel saw the Torah? I'm sure there were nuances of difference between them. I mean, they lived in different generations and in different years and times. But what was their way? What was the lens that they used to see the Torah that they studied in the world in which they lived? And what my desire is, my impetus, my drive for contributing what it is that I contribute to this endeavor, to this project, to this Bet Midrash, is to provide that lens in a way that is in your grasp, to bring the tremendous toil that otherwise would be required down to your space, to earth, so that you're able to access it. Because to me, it's as though there is this, say imagine there's a physical lens in a nice protected pocket that is buried somewhere that only very few people knew how to access or had access to. And then suddenly it kind of lost its presence and its direction and the awareness that it was even there. And what I want to do is I want to take it out, I want to shine it, and I want to present it to all of you. And that's really what it is that this is about. Nothing else. I mean, there are maybe derivative elements of it. So sure, you'll learn about Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan, which is wonderful because he was wonderful. But there's an added element to that. You're learning about Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan tonight because when you learn about him and you learn about the way that he wrote and he thought, you will begin to put together that lens. And every element of study on this platform, that is my dedication to you as the Rosh Bet Midrash. Every element of study on this platform will help fill in and create clarity for that framework and lens. Now, I want to say a bit about why that's important. Because all of this may be intuitive and maybe that I'm speaking to the choir. But as I always say at Lauderdale Road and at Bevis Marks when I'm on the pulpit, I've said this many times, I believe in preaching to the choir. Because it's the choir who needs to hear this. And it's important that the choir knows why they're singing and in which framework they're singing. And so this is what I think is important to understand about framework in general, about concept, context, lens in general. There is no inherent value to isolated data points. I could bring you a line from the Talmud and I could give it to 10 different people. I could give it to my friends in my interfaith relations. I can give it to my imam friends and I can give it to my Anglican priest friends. And they will interpret it in different ways based on their frameworks. And their interpretations would be false. Even though they may be good, they maybe have insights, but they are not interpreting it within the context it was meant to be seen in. And that is very important for us to understand. Now, when we talk about within Israel and the various strands of perspective within Israel, the various frameworks within the Jewish people, I wouldn't say that the way that they see it necessarily is wrong if it's not the classical Sephardi way of seeing it. As we know, we have great tradition in Israel that there are more than one way to see the Torah, more than one way to see the Torah. But what you're here for is our way, this specific way, the way of our fathers and grandfathers, the way of our ancestors. That, as I say, is a lens that has been kind of lost and left aside. And what I'd like to do is to be able to represent it to you in whatever capacity I can. And I believe that we have an absolutely unique opportunity to be able to do that because the online element of this Bet Midrash allows us to draw the greatest teachers from all over to teach you. Professor Zohar speaking to you from Israel tonight. You will have teachers to speak to you from New York. You'll have teachers to speak to you from London. You'll have teachers to speak to you from other countries and other cities. And how beautiful is that? And how exciting is that? I'm excited. I'm certainly excited. Sin is excited that there's more than 30 members. I'm excited that we get to bring teachers from all over the place to be able to teach you and teach you in the best possible way. Not that he's not excited about that, but you know what I mean. I just like to pick on him every now and then because I love him. So the important thing is to recognize before you start any of the learning, remember that more important than any detail you study, any data point that you study, is the framework within which you process it. the way in which you see it. In Hebrew, the word for that is derech. It's a way. There are many ways one can do something. The way is what makes the difference as to the quality and value of what is done. It's the same thing that we would perhaps, use or express when we say to somebody, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. And any of us who have been in such a situation know precisely how important that is. There are times where people can say things in a certain way and that not even be a tone of voice, just a facial expression that makes all the difference in terms of its meaning. You know what we call the nonverbals. The nonverbals make all the difference in the world in terms of what something means, do they not? A simple tone of voice going up or down at the end of a sentence makes all the difference in terms of what it is that it means to us, does it not? Of course it does. Do not underestimate the framework. Do not underestimate the way, the derech, and the value it has on the information that you will study. And what we are presenting here is not data points as much as a way. It is why I want you to consider the following 2 points, and then, of course, I will hand it over. And that is this. The Torah itself is extremely concerned about this. And there are 2 ways that we know that the Torah itself, I mean the written Torah itself, is extremely concerned about this. How do we know this? We know this from the following 2 ways. First way is that there is a very strict rule as to how it is that a Sefer Torah must be written. And that is that it's not just that the letters need to be shaped a certain way. The graphic presentation of the Torah must be preserved in a certain way. What do I mean by graphic presentation? Any of you who have seen the inside of Sefer Torah, and there's no reason why any of you should not have seen the inside of a Sefer Torah, whether you're man or woman, you should have been able to see the inside of a Sefer Torah. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why there is a halacha to show the Sefer to the Kahal is so that the Kahal can see the Sefer Torah, right? So you will have seen at the very least at a glance the inside of a Sefer. And you will have noticed that the Sefer has paragraphs. In other words, there are blocks of writing with gaps of no writing and then blocks of writing again. Yes? Yes? Can I get some head nods? Thank you. Yes. So you know what I'm talking about. There's Sefer Torah. It's graphic. It has a very strict graphic presentation. Why strict? Because, listen to this, the halacha is, the law is that if a Sefer Torah is meant to have a specific gap with no writing, I'm not even talking about the writing. Writing is pristine and perfect. The letters are expertly crafted. But there is in one place a gap that is meant to run to the end of the line with no more writing. We call that a pituha. And instead, it was written as a gap in the middle, and writing was carried up again on that same line inappropriately, meaning not according to our tradition. The entire Sefer Torah is pasul. It is invalid for use. It doesn't have the same holiness and sanctity of a Sefer Torah. You hear what I'm saying? Everybody follow what I just said? If the gap is not an appropriate gap according to our tradition, the entire Sefer Torah loses its kedusha. It is no longer a Sefer Torah. And why is that? Because the graphic presentation of the Sefer is essential. You say, well, what is the graphic presentation? Well, there's a lot in the graphic presentation, but this is one minor element which makes the difference in terms of the holiness of a Sefer and not the holiness of a Sefer. When you have a gap that is meant to be blank to the end of the line, right? So I have writing to the middle of the line, gap till the end, and then the new line starts on the next line, that is an indication that the relationship between the 2 paragraphs are further than if it were a closed gap. on the same line. Yeah, I understand I'm asking you to do all of this visually in your heads, but you following what I'm saying? A way to recognize this is Roman numeral outlines. So one Roman numeral and a second Roman numeral, right? When I'm ready to go to Roman numeral 2, which means that I'm ready to talk about a new subject or a new section of a subject, is equivalent essentially to a Sefer Torah having a gap all the way to the end of the line. You follow? If the gap is in the middle and picks up writing on that same line, it's like a letter under one Roman numeral. It's a sub-element of a already open concept or situation, idea. If that's messed up, the whole way I understand the Sefer is messed up. You follow me now? Contextual presentation, not the words, not the data points. The contextual presentation of the data makes or breaks a Sefer Torah. And I'm going to close with this, with 1 minute left. One of my most favorite lines, and there's so many, from Harambam. Rambam writes the following in his Pirusha Mishnah, in his explanation, his commentary on the Mishnah. This is at the very end, the last lines of his commentary on the tractate of Berachot, the first tractate of the Mishnah. And he says the following. He says, Darki tamid, my way always. Bechol makom, sheyesh eze remez b'inyanei emunah, avair mashu. Anytime there's even a hinting of the system of our belief, right, the way we think, I will pause to explain something about it. No matter what issue we're dealing with, I will stop and start to talk a bit about that. He says, why? Ki hashuv etzli. Rambam says it's more important to me lehazbir yesod miyesodot, to explain the foundation fundamentals of our dat, of our whole way of Torah, mikol davar acher shani melamed, than anything else that I teach. And Harambam taught it all. It wasn't a bit of Torah Harambam didn't teach. So you hear what he's saying? He's saying it's more important for me to teach you the fundamental principles, the frameworks, the way in which we think, than it is for me to teach any piece of information that I will ever teach you. So, with that, welcome to the Habura, because it is an exciting trip and we are on an intriguing path. It is a way that belongs to you. It is a way that lies in waiting for you to come and claim. It is the way of your ancestors, and it is your right and privilege to be able to come and discover it and to make it part of your life, to use it as a lens through which to see all that you see. So I wish you Hatzlacha Rabba, and I'm sure that we will see each other soon again. And if I don't see you before Shavuot, I wish you all a Hag Shavuot Sameach. What a wonderful time of year to launch a Bet Midrash. And I hope that you enjoy the Professor Zohar's presentation on the B'Yisrael Moshe Hazan. And I see that here he is. Reb Tzvi, Hashem Yishmerechem. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Rav. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Now, please stay. We're going to be having Professor Zvi Zohar continue his series on Chokot Goyim with the perspective of Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Hazan. A reminder that, well, not a reminder, but it's a new piece of information that July 5th, the first shiur that we're having as part of the membership program, will be taking place at Lauderdale Road in London. And we are very excited to have a big projector / screen so that all the international students are able to join in as we will do for the rest of the curriculum. So what I'm going to do now is ask Professor Zohar. I'm just going to find you here, and I'm going to make you co-host, Professor, and I'm going to pin you.
Okay. All right, can you hear me?
I can indeed. Just a quick intro to the professor. I'm sure a lot of you already know the professor. He's been with us a few times, and a couple of weeks ago we had part 1 of the series. Professor Zohar studied 3 years at Merkaz Harav Yeshiva and was appointed the professor of Sephardic law and ethics at Bar Ilan University. And we are very, very, very excited to have someone who's written on history, Sephardi Machshava, Sephardi Halacha, with us here to continue this very exciting series. And of course, one of the highest voted series for the membership curriculum, which is the Rabbinic Creativity in the Modern Middle East, which will be starting in our membership curriculum period. Professor, thank you for being here. The stage is yours. B'chavod.
Okay, very well, and thank you. And b'sha'a tova. This is the second of a series about a Teshuvah Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan, who at the time this Teshuvah was written, I'll remind you, was the rabbi in Rome. The year is 1848, and the question he began with was whether it's possible to, or it's permissible to establish a bell tower with a clock in proximity to the synagogue, under the idea that when the clock chimes, it will remind people, the Jewish people, the neighborhood, about the time, and they will be able to attend services properly without forgetting what the time is. And he began with the Teshuvah of Rabbi Yosef Kolon. This is recapitulating what we did last week, or 2 weeks ago, actually. He began with the Teshuvah Rabbi Yosef Kolon, who lived in Italy and died in 1460, who determined that the Hukot HaGoyim, the forbidden practices of the Gentiles, which we should not follow, fall under two rubrics. One is if it's something which is absolutely illogical, it has no logic, and it's just so, and the Goyim do it just so, not because of any specific logic, and therefore, if we do it, there's no reason for doing it except that we're imitating and following the Goyim, and we shouldn't be doing that. And the other is if the practice of the Goyim has something to do with very negative values that we should reject. Otherwise, what the Goyim do and the Jews do is what is reasonable and not strongly negative from a moral perspective, is something that the Jews and non-Jews do as human beings for the same rationale, and there's no isur about that. And very easily, after a relatively short time, Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan was able to show on this logic that there's nothing wrong and it's perfectly reasonable to have this bell tower. And he could have stopped at this point, but obviously if you look at the Teshuvah, you realize that he wanted to use this question as a stepping stone to the larger issue of, in general, the relationship between Jewish behavior and non-Jewish behavior, especially in the field of religious activity. And he took issue, okay, the Bach Beit Chadash, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis of Poland, from the 17th century, had written that Jews in synagogue service may use the same type of music that the Gentiles use in their services, but they shouldn't take the exact same tunes. And Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan said, well, actually, I don't agree with that, because the question is, why would one think that you would be interested in using the same tunes? And the reason might be that these things work. And if it works, it has a certain psychological, experiential effect upon your religious experience, then it has a logic to it. If it has a logic to it, it's not hukot hagoyim, but it's rather falls back into the area of mishpatim or rational. And he takes up the question of the entire or aspects of the temple service, which the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim admitted that he had difficulty. Why were they using wine in the temple? Why were they using certain other elements of incense? And he cited the commentary of Shem Tov and Shem Tov on the Rambam, who said the reason is that human beings in general are affected by the senses, the five senses, and the whole construct of the temple was to give people a multi-sensory experience of being in a king's palace and a king's home. And therefore it was very richly decorated, and there were people playing music, and there was incense and lights and whatever. And the temple is constructed to give the visitors to the temple who come, all right, Shavuot, Aliyah LaRegel, people come and they have the experience, or they should have the experience, that they're visiting in the palace of the most great and exalted king, because in parentheses, really, God doesn't need the temple. Okay, the temple is built to provide a certain religious experience of being in the presence of the king of the universe to the people that come there. And therefore, music is an important element, and it was an important element in the temple and other things. Now, and he says at this point, the distinction between which music falls apart, and he says, and now I'll bring you, and here we're getting back, and I'll share a screen with you. Just a minute. Yes. Okay, I'm going to share a certain screen which will look different, but okay, here we are. Okay, and this is where we reach the second time, and I'm going to try to make the text bigger. Okay, and at this point he says, and here we're continuing in number 12, ויש לי ראיה גדולה, I have a great proof, שכל דבר יש לו טעם נכון משום הנאה או כבוד או הטבע מחייבו לפי מנהגי המדינות ושמיעי ארצות, anything that has a rationale that's connected to it causes certain pleasure or a sense of honor, or that human nature relates to it positively according to the various customs of the various countries and the different places. אפילו שאותו דבר נתייחד לעבודת איזה כנסיות מאיזה אומה שתהיה, although this form, this specific experience has already been employed for worship by the houses of worship of whatever nation, מלבד שהדבר ההוא מותר לישראל ולא משום לא תלכו בחוקות הגויים, not only is this permitted and it's not forbidden under the rubric of חוקות הגויים, אלא אדרבה, but even more than that, mitzvah lelech bedarchehem, it's a mitzvah to follow in the way of how the Gentiles do it, ולהדר בתי כנסיות שלנו, and to bring honor and a great positive impression to our בתי כנסת, בכל מיני הידור וכבוד השווה לכל נפש אדם מאותה מדינה. Okay, in each country there are certain ways of doing things and certain types of cultural and sensory experiences make an impression on people in that country. And these things are geographically oriented, he holds. Lechol nefesh adam me'ota medina. In this area of the world, people experience certain tunes, certain behaviors, certain gestures in certain way as honorable, respectful, a sense of awe, and so on. And whatever works in that context works for Jews and non-Jews equally, and therefore the Jews are permitted, in fact, should be encouraged to follow that way. And what is his proof? This is a proof, and we're just going to see that in a moment. The question that was asked of Rashbash, al kahal sheratzu lahaskim, a synagogue that wanted to reach an haskama, to ordain for their community, שלא להיכנס אדם בבית הכנסת במנעלים, that people should not come into the Bet Knesset with shoes on, מחמת החרפה שמחרפים הישמעאלים, because this causes intense disrespect and dishonor to the Jewish behavior on the part of the Muslims. Okay, and he goes on to sum up this teshuvah, but actually we're going to see it in the original in a moment. Okay, and here you have it. And you have that Rabbi Shlomo ben Shimon Doran was born in the city of Algiers in 1400. His father, Tashbetz, was a great rabbi who had come from Spain to North Africa. And Shlomo ben Shimon Doran became a Dayan in 1444, even in his father's life. Then he became the chief rabbi of Algiers in 1444, and he passed away in 1467. And he is writing here to the Dayan Rabbi Amram ben Chacham ben Binyamin, who comes from Bejaia in Algeria. Sha'alta, you asked. Kahal sheratzu lehaskim, a community wished to reach an ordinance. Sh'reiknes adam lebet hakneset b'mina'alim, mahamat chirpat shemecharfim otam ha'ishmaelim, because the Muslims deride people who come into a respected place when they're wearing shoes. Ve'od שבעיר ההיא עצמה יש בית כנסת אחר ואין נכנסים בו במנעלים. There already is a different synagogue in that community where people have already agreed not to come in with shoes, but apparently this community that is now contemplating making this a decision is people that came from Spain, right? And in Spain, everybody comes in shoe or boots or sandals or whatever into Bet Knesset. And now they're in a different place. And some people in the community want to change the minhag. And some people rejected this and said, why so? Rambam himself allows people to come to Bet Knesset in shoes. Then you wanted to hear my opinion on this topic. Okay, so here is what Rashbash Shlomo ben Shimon Doran says. Teshuva. דבר ידוע הוא שבית הכנסת ראוי לפארו ולרוממו ולכבדו ולהרחיק ממנו כל מיני ביזיון. It's clear and well known and obvious that in a Bet Knesset we should make it the most beautiful, sublime, and honorable, and to distance from the Bet Knesset anything that is negative and disgusting or repulsive. And now he says, however, what does this mean? אומנם הכבוד הוא כל דבר אשר הוא נחשב אצל בני אדם כבוד. What does honorable, impressive, striking also mean? It means something that causes a certain reaction on the part of the people who are there. Okay, so now we're going down a bit. He says, okay, now that we understood that, הכבוד והביזיון האמיתי הוא כפי מחשבת בני אדם וכפי המקומות. Okay, there are certain things that are universal, he believes, in all human beings, and certain things that are culture bound and in a cultural context, different people experience this differently. כי הכבוד והביזיון האמיתי הוא כבוד הנפש וביזיון הנפש. What really matters is the internal quality of the person's soul and personality. אבל יש כבוד מדומה וביזיון מדומה, but there are certain things which seem like honorable and seem like disgusting and כי אם ילבש אדם בגדים נעים, הוא בעיני בני האדם נחשב לכבוד. If somebody will wear clothing that people think is honorable clothing, they will respect that person. ואם ילבש בגדים מתולעים, but if he wears clothing that's full of patches and sewn together and mended, הוא נחשב בעיניהם לביזיון. This will be considered by people as something dishonorable and lowly. אף על פי שאין תוספת בעצם נפש האדם כשילבש בגדים נעים ולא חיסרון בלבשו בגדים מתולעים, אלא כפי מחשבת האדם. The person, if we have a brilliant, genius, tzaddik, who wears very poor and unattractive clothing, that really doesn't say anything about that person, and vice versa. If we have someone who is negative, wicked, cruel, and so on, and that person wears very honorable clothing, that really doesn't say anything about the person himself. Okay? אלא כפי מחשבת האדם. People relate to the external impression created by various things. ויש בגדים, there are some clothing, שאם ילבש אותם אדם במקום אחד הם תפארת. If somebody will wear a certain type of clothing in a certain place, they will be considered wonderfully honorable. ואם ילבשם במקום אחר הם גנאי. But if that same person with the same clothing would now go to a different place, he would be looked down upon. והכל לפי כפי המקומות וכפי האדם והקש על זה. From this you can derive a general mode of thinking about these things. Okay. ולפיכך דברים שאנו חושבים אותם גנאי וביזיון לאדם, things that we consider negative and disrespectful, לא נעשים לפני הקדוש ברוך הוא ולא במקומות המקודשים. We won't do this when we consider ourselves to be in the presence of God or in holy places. Now, obviously, we are in the presence of God always. But we think about this at certain times and places which are constructed or directed to that experience, and there it's inappropriate to behave or wear or look in a negative way. Okay. כל מה שאנו חושבים אותו לביזיון ראוי להתרחק מלעשותו לפני הקדוש ברוך הוא, וכן הדין, and that's in fact הלכה, לא לעשותו במקומות המכובדים. No, okay, not supposed to spit, cough, whatever. Okay. כל דבר שהוא ביזיון לפני בשר ודם, השבינן לביזיון לפני הקדוש ברוך הוא ואין ראוי לעשותו. How do we know? We know what if we did it in the presence of another human being, that human being would feel that we're being disrespectful, we're acting in a disgusting, negative way. That guides us how to behave when we consider ourselves to be in the place or the presence of God. And how does this now relate to the issue at hand? In the countries of the Christians. שאין אצלם ביזיון כשנכנס אדם ואפילו לפני מלכם במנהל. People come in to the house, even to a palace, even they come before the king and they're wearing boots. They just got off their horse. They come into the palace, right? You see the movies, and there they are bowing down before the king, wearing their shoes or boots or whatever. In those countries, therefore, in those countries, if somebody comes into the Bet Knesset shod with shoes or boots, that's fine. It's not bizayon. But here we are in North Africa. שהוא ביזיון להיכנס לפני גדוליהם וכל שכן לפני מלכם במנהל. In these countries, it's considered highly disrespectful to enter into the presence of a high-ranking individual, and certainly the king, when your feet are in boots or sandals or shoes. Therefore, in these countries, אסור להיכנס בעירם בבית הכנסת במנהל. In these countries, for the same reason that you can't do it, or you wouldn't do it in an honorable, local, high-ranking person, you shouldn't do it in shul, in bet synagogue, mishum kal vachomer. ומה לפני מלך בשר ודם אינו עושים כן, לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא על אחת כמה וכמה. So therefore, is a kal vachomer from the behavior in a normal social context in the presence of a high-ranking person, kal vachomer, not to act that way, or inappropriate, what's considered inappropriate before God in those places. Okay. And he repeats this once again. People come up to their own bed and they only take off their shoes, hopefully, before they get into their bed. But into the most intimate places in their home, they come with the same shoes from the street. In those countries, מותר להיכנס בבית הכנסת שבעירם בסנדלים, אבל בארצות אלו שמקפידים להיכנס בביתם בסנדלים, אסור להיכנס בבית הכנסת בסנדלים, ואין הדבר תלוי במה שעושה האדם בביתו. In other words, let's say you came from Spain and you're used to wearing shoes everywhere. And therefore, when you come into your home now in the town of Algiers, you continue going into your house wearing shoes that you just came off the street. Now you say, well, I do it in my own home. I'll do it in synagogue also. He says, no. אין הדבר תלוי במה שעושה האדם בביתו, אלא במה שמקפידים בני האדם. What is the social convention that people take offense at here? שאם הוא מזוהם בביתו, if you in your home act in a disgusting, repulsive, dirty way, ונכנס בסנדלים, and you come into your home shod, אין ראוי לזהם בית אלוהינו. על כן טוב הדבר, and therefore it's very good, אשר רצו לעשות, להסיר חרפת האומה אשר חרפונו. And therefore, the decision that they wanted to take to forbid Jewish people, even those who are used to wearing shoes at home, from coming into Bet Knesset with shoes is a good thing. להסיר חרפת האומה אשר חרפונו, because what? the way that the Jewish religion looks in the eyes of the non-Jews is important. Okay, we are the representatives on earth, as it were, of the Kadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, if we behave in ways that cause other honorable people to regard us negatively and to say, look how the Jews are acting in their Beit Knesset, that's a critique that should resonate with us. ואם הראשונים לא התקינו אינה טענה או ראיה שהדבר מותר, the fact that until now they didn't make that rule doesn't prove anything. שמקום הניחו לאחרונים להתגדר בו, the rabbis of previous times left space and left room for us to make improvements as we feel are correct and appropriate. אין לומר שכיוון אשר היו לפניהם לא אמרו דבר שראוי לאחרונים לשתוק, the fact that until now nobody brought this up doesn't mean that ipso facto it's something that we have to continue. Okay, and I'll go down, and he says, Alma, and a general rule is שהדין משתנה בזה כפי מנהג המקומות, halacha changes, meaning the specific content of halacha. Halacha says, act honorably, respectively, and decently in Bet Knesset in the presence of God. But the specific content of what it means to act decently, appropriately, and honorably in the presence of God, הדין משתנה בזה, כפי מנהג המקומות, במה שחושבים אותו כנאי, או במה שחושבים אותו כבוד. The specific content of act honorably and decently changes with what people in each place and time think is honorable and different. וזה ברור הרבה, he says, this is so clear. לא הייתי צריך להביא עליו ראיה. I really didn't need to bring any proof for this. שאיך אפשר, how is it possible, שבבית ישמעאלי אחד פחות שבבחוטים, even in the most low, simple, and unimportant Muslim person, לא יוכל אדם להיכנס במנעל, you can't go in there in a shoe, ובבית אלוהינו, בית אלוהים ייכנס, איזהו כבודו ואיזהו מוראו, and then he says, ואפילו לא היה בדבר איסור, even if it wasn't an express rule in halacha that we have to act in an honorable and decent way in Bet Knesset. Let's say we had no rules of our own in that respect. ואפילו לא היה בדבר איסור, היה ראוי לעשות תקנה בדבר משום חרפת האומה. Even if there were no halachot that forbid this or that behavior in the Bet Knesset, but certain behaviors of ours in Bet Knesset would cause the non-Jews to look very negatively at the Jewish nation, okay, that itself would be a reason for us to adjust our behavior accordingly. Okay, so this is the teshuvah of Rabbi Shlomo ben Shimon Doran, and now getting back to Yisrael Moshe Chazan, right? He begins citing it here, and he goes on to cite it, and you saw it now in the original, and he says, okay, here, from this we can learn two general things. One, משהו כבוד וביזיון אמיתי הוא כבוד הנפש וביזיון הנפש, והוא בעצם, this is something inherent. What's the internal honor and respectfulness, and that's something which has to do with the personality, okay, and the different senses that's common to all human beings, okay. וכיוצא בזה הוא כבוד הנפש וביזיון הנפש לכל בני האדם, ישראל ואומות העולם בכל מקום ובכל זמן הם שם. There is certain, he believes, which is, I don't know, this is factually the case, or that anthropologists have found this. Okay, there are certain things which he believes are general to human beings around the world and are not culturally contextual. I mean, I've heard it said, I don't know if it's true, right, that if you smile, everybody around the world will realize that you're making a positive facial expression. And if you make certain other threatening, that right, so there are certain things that are generally, or if you cry out in pain, people will recognize this, and around the world. Shenit, he says, and what was the second thing we learned from the Rashbam, who bizayon vekavod hanefesh hameduma, what we imagine, vehu lefi minhag anshe ha'aratzot. But this is culturally contextual. The Ashmo'inan bazeh Rashbash, Rabbi Shimon Doran taught us, she'im umat ha'olam, if the non-Jews in a certain locale, מפני שהם בני אדם המרגישים ביישובו של עולם, if the goyim do something, and they do it, why? Because they are human beings and they have certain impressions, certain sentiments, certain cultural conventions, על יישובו של עולם, if they תפסו באיזה דברים המורגשים והמוחשים בכבוד הנפש העצמית או המדומית, if the people in a certain locale, non-Jews, because of their sensibilities as human beings, have adopted certain behaviors or rejected and consider very negative other behaviors, but they take certain behaviors positively, ליופי שלמותם והידורם, okay, said because of they're so beautiful and perfect in the eyes of the people in that country, and therefore, סדרום ועשאום וקבעום וייחדום לבית תפילתם לכבוד ולתפארת כיוצא בזה, they, thinking things to be especially beautiful, attractive, and lovely, adopted it in their divine service and prayer. Why? Because they are human beings and they want to bring the most beautiful and wonderful things to their worship. Or on the other hand, or conversely, they distanced from their service or their church or mosque or whatever, things which they consider very negative and repulsive. In all of these honorable or negative things, Ashmu'inan Rashbash Zah, Rabbi Shlomo ben Shimon taught us, Ki lo mibaya, we don't have to say, אם הישראלים קרבו מכובדים בבית הכנסת ולחקו ממנו עמוזים בדמות אומות העולם ממש, let's say the people in that locale who were Jewish have already, from time immemorial, for a long time, been doing things very similar to the Goyim. What the Goyim consider honorable, the Jews consider honorable. Therefore, what the Goyim do it in their Bet Tefillah, the Jews also do it, or vice versa. So we don't, not only Einam Ovrim Mishum Uvechukottehem Lo Telechu, or Lo Ta'asu Kema'asehem Vechadome. Not only is this not something which Torah forbids, Shaharei, אנו מיישובו של עולם גמרינן ולא מנייהו, because if we and they are living in the same place for some time and we and they have the same social, cultural, aesthetic conventions, so both of us imported this from the general cultural context into our worship, because we took the best of the cultural context and took it into our worship and rejected what's negative. Anu miyishuvo shel olam gamrinan velomi. We didn't copy this from the Goyim, right? Ki gam anachnu bnei adam. We, as they are human beings, hamargishim uboharim batov, and we sense what's good and choose what's good. Lefi rov deot bnei tevel, either according to what everyone in the world or most people in the world experience, or behergel yoshevei hamedina, or according to what's custom in that country, ish va'ish yulad ba. And the Jews that are born in that country have very similar sensibilities to the non-Jews. Umoasim bara, and they choose what's good and they reject what's bad. So that's obvious that that's fine, that if we see that we and the Goyim have independently, each of us adopted the same modes of behavior, we now don't have to stop doing this because we suddenly realize that the Goyim also do it. No, both of us took it from the general culture, the human culture of which we are part. But he says the Rashbash even indicates more than that. Od zot chidusha sho'in al Rashbash, the adrabah. Not only we are permitted and it's fine to follow the same conventions in our Beit Knesset as they're going in theirs, adrabah mechuyavim anachnu lidamot alehem. We have to want to act like they do. Ulefaer uleromem kenesiotenu, our synagogues, kemohem. בכל מיני דברים המורגשים בכבוד הנפש יהיו עצמי ומדומים. We, let's say until now, we didn't catch on. We weren't aware of certain very fine, attractive, aesthetically pleasing things that existed in this culture because we had not heard church music, for instance. Then, and now we hear it and well, that's great. He said, the Rashbas teaches us that we should adopt that, because otherwise our oivim, or the people that are opposed to us, will say, in that cultural context, the Jews, if they act in certain ways, will look terrible to the Goyim, and that's something that we should avoid. The Hashta, now that we have seen this, he says, let's think about this. If, for instance, imagine, the nations with whom we live, בנו בית תפילתם בבניין משוכלל ומפואר, ארוך עין ליופיו. The people where we live have built a most wonderful place of worship in a wonderful, sophisticated, and a very attractive building. שהנפש נהנית ממנו ומכבדת בו, ולעוצם יופיו ייחדו לבית תפילתם. They realized what type of architecture really causes very positive, wonderful, and sublime feelings. And that's how exactly they built their place of worship. Okay, now we didn't do that until now. היאמן כי יסופר, can you believe, שבשביל שעשו וייחדו לעבודתם, לכבוד ולתפארת, because the Goyim discovered before we discovered how beautiful you can make a building, they discovered it before us. היאמן כי יסופר, that because they did that, שאנחנו אסורים לבנות כמותו בית אלוהינו. Can you imagine, he says, that because the Goyim put on before us what wonderful aesthetics and sublime architecture can be done, we are not allowed to do it. Why? Because the Goyim did it first. Can you imagine? If they, before us, establish these ways of architecture and decoration and aesthetics for use in their holy places, are we now, because of this, bound and chained and prevented from using these same modes and these same conventions and these same architectural things in our place of worship? Well, okay, זה לא חשב אנוש. This is something which no intelligent person can believe. Okay, and now he says, so you see that the issue here is that Rashbash and also, of course, Rabbi Samon Sheikh Hazan himself, who cites Rashbash and explicates the implicit meaning, human beings have common sensibilities, and it's right and appropriate to use the most, whatever works best to create certain experiences for worshiping God and constructing places of worship and decorating them and so on. And the fact that the Goyim did it first before us cannot mean that we should refrain from that. However, he says, ostensibly the Rambam says otherwise. The Rambam in Hilchot Avodah Zarah writes, ולא יבנה מקומות כבניין היכלות של עבודה זרה, you should not construct or may not construct buildings in the same way as the temples of Avodah Zarah, כדי שייכנסו בהם רבים כמו שעושים מהם. So in order that many people shall come into those buildings in the manner that the Goyim do. And therefore, it would seem that if the Goyim build a place of worship, right, it would seem that the Rambam, when he says Hechalot, which really means palaces, is talking about places of worship. And if the Goyim build places of worship in a certain way, palatial buildings, we can't do that. But now he goes into analysis of it. He says that can't be the plain meaning of the text. And he discusses the various meanings, which I won't, possible meanings. And he gets to what is the correct meaning in his view. Okay. האמת הוא כוונת הרמב"ם ז"ל על הפן השני. There's a different way, which is the correct way of understanding what the Rambam says. שפירש הרב מרכבת המשנה אשכנזי. Okay. To works of commentary on Mishneh Torah have the same name, Merkevet HaMishneh. One of them was written by a Sephardi and one by an Ashkenazi, and he says, the Merkevet HaMishneh Ashkenazi, hu הפירוש האמיתי וממנו לא נזוע. Okay, and who is this? This is Rabbi Shlomo ben Moshe of Chelma, which is Chelem. And if you look him up, you'll see that he was a rare individual at that time and place in Eastern Europe who integrated Torah studies and general studies. He says, Sheva Chochmot, he studied mathematics, he studied astronomy, he studied philosophy, and he takes pride in that. And he here says that when the Rambam says lo yivnei mekomot, like the Avodah Zarah, he says Rabbeinu Rambam hotzi din ze me'atorat kohanim, from the Sifra, the Tanaitic work on the Torah. Bechukotehem lo telechu. What does this mean? Shelo telchu, and this is a Sifra if you look. Shelo telchu banimusot shelahem kadvarim hamechokekim lem. Don't follow their norms and behaviors. Kegon teatraot vekirkasaot veistereot. Okay, don't build buildings like the Goyim do as theaters and circuses. Now, what does it mean, theaters and circuses? The Aruch is the great dictionary of rabbinic terms composed around the 1100 by Rabbi Natan of Rome. Hem binyanim be'gova, high buildings, lirot misham haschok, to see performances. Ubemusaf ha'aruch, a commentary and expansion of the Aruch. Who was written by whom? Somebody who was born in Spain as Anus. V'chazar ledat Yisrael Rav Binyamin Musafia, and he expanded upon the Aruch based on what? His knowledge of Latin and Greek, which he learned in Spain before returning to Judaism. Erech Teater, Musaf Aruch כתב שבזמן קדמון, in ancient times, היו בעיר רומא 3 בניינים משוערים שנקראו, כן, there were very large buildings called Teater or Teatron, ויש מפרשים, go up. Whoop. קיר כסאות, מקום שמתקבצים לשתות יין, place where they gather to drink wine. עד כאן דברי מרכבת המשנה, ודבר השם בפיהו אמת, שזהו ודאי כוונת הרמב"ם. He said, לא יבנה מקומות כבניין נחלות של עקום. Don't build palatial, large, giant buildings like the Akum do, כדי שייכנסו בהם רבים, where many people can come in. He says, this is not talking about a place of worship, because a place of worship where the more or few people come in is asur, and the very idea of many people coming together, that's not forbidden. גם אנחנו, היה לנו בית עולמים, we had a temple which was very big, and many people came there, so the idea that many people will come into a large area is not per se forbidden. Giant, sumptuous buildings for the purpose that many people come in, לראות השחוק והקלות ראש וכיוצא מהבלי העולם, כמו שהיה קולוסאו. What's the Colosseo? The Colosseum. And now, writes Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan, in his capacity as chief rabbi of Rome in 1848, Ad hayom hu chai v'kayam. Until today, you can see the Colosseum in Rome. בקום עשה כי התכנסו בו רבים לראות השחוק והקלות ראש, בניין כזה ודאי אסור לישראל. This is what the Rambam says, not to build large buildings for public gatherings like the Goyim do, for the same purposes. And the Rambam himself says that spending your time on such activities is a very negative thing. And now comments Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan, Vechen hu emet, and that's really true. Ki ad hayom, until today, mishenaga yirat Hashem bilevavo, somebody who is in awe of God, v'shalem b'de'otav, and has correct and perfect hashkofa about these things, monea atzmo מריבוי הליכת התיאטראות וכיוצא. Now, note this word, which I wrote in a different color, right? Moshe Chazan doesn't say that somebody who is deeply religious and so on and so forth, מונע עצמו מהליכת התיאטראות. Doesn't say anybody who is deeply religious doesn't go to theater. He says he doesn't go a lot to theater. Right? He's living in Rome in 1848, and obviously Jews do go to theater, but he says from time to time it's okay. But if you do it a lot, then you're displaying values that are inconsonant with the true devotion to God. Okay, let me see what we have now. He says, then he says, well, you know what? Jews can't or should not build such buildings for Jews, because Jews are forbidden from going to such places, so why would a Jew want to build it? He said, but let's say, as an investment, a Jew wants to build a large theater for public spectacles and plays and other activities. Okay. בעיר שרובה גויים והישראלי בונהו כדי להשכירו לגויים, you build it to rent it to גויים, ודאי מותר. Okay, and then he says, ומזה הלצתי בעד, and under this logic, I supported or lended support בעד גבירי, to the honorable individual, השר והתפסר מחזיק ביד לומדי התורה, the wealthy, honorable individual who supports many Torah scholars, שלמה בן אוליאל, שבנה תיאטרו אחד בגיברלטר להשכירו. A Jewish person in Gibraltar, which at that time was already under British rule, built a theater to rent it out to Goyim, and Rabbi Moshe Chazan said, you could do that. And then he says, ובפרט שהתיאטרו של עכשיו, the theaters and what goes on in theaters today, אינו כמו הראשונים, שהיה עניין עבודה זרה באמצעות כנודע. Theaters today are not places where they have worship or sacrifices to avodah zarah. By the way, if you visit Rome, as my wife and I just did recently, just before the Corona, you see in the Colosseum that they had these games with the gladiators and the animals and the gladiators killing each other. And in the middle, they had different acts of worship of Avodah Zarah. So Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan says, you know what? Today, the theater is not like it used to be. Ure'ayala davar, and the proof of this is, שרבים ונכבדים הולכים לעבור את השעה. Many honorable Jewish people go there to pass away the time. ונהרה נהרה ופשטה, and in different rivers and different regions, people act differently. Okay, so there's a lot more to be said about this teshuvah, and brings many other fascinating sources, which you can either read at your leisure, or perhaps maybe at some time in the future we can get back to this. But I just want to end with a report that he brings about Izmir. Okay, until now, what has he said? That if there's certain modes of music, of aesthetics, and so on, that they're going to use in their divine service, and it works because the Jews in that place have the same sensibilities, then there's no reason for us to deny ourselves from use of that. Okay. And so I'll conclude with what he brings toward the end. I mean, there's a lot more here, but let heaven and earth bear witness for me. שבהיותי בעיר גדולה של חכמים ושל סופרים, סמירנה, יכוננה עליון אמן. When I was in the great city of Chachamim and Sofrim, Izmir in Turkey, from which his family hailed, ראיתי מגדולי החכמים המפורסמים, I saw great and famous rabbis, שהיו משוררים גדולים על משקל המוסיקה, that knew how to sing and lead services wonderfully, the Shira, right? According to the various modes of music, and they were great experts in that. ובראשם הרב המופלא אברהם הכהן אריאס. ולמשקל המוסיקה של ימים נוראים, and in order to find the appropriate mode of music for the Yamim Noraim, the High Holy Days, הצריכה הכנעה גדולה נקראת אצלם חיזון. The music of the High Holy Days has to be such that it creates a sense of hakna'ah, of people submitting themselves to the great and awesome God. And this is called hizun, like hazan. היו הולכים בכנסיית הנוצרים מאחורי הפרגוד בימי חגם. To prepare for the high holiday services in the Bet Knesset, the greatest rabbis and hazanim would go into the Christian church, מאחורי הפרגוד, okay, behind a curtain where they presumably couldn't be seen, on the days of the Christian holidays, during the service, להתלמד מהם אותו הקול המוכנע, המשבר הלב, to learn from them the modes of that type of music that causes the person's heart to become broken and submissive before God. והיו מסדרים מאותם הקולות, and from these tunes and melodies, היו מסדרים, they would arrange קדישים וקדושות דבר פלא, the most wonderful kiddushot, the most wonderful tune for Kaddish and Yamim Noraim, they would take from the church. Now, the church in Izmir, right? It's the Greek Orthodox Church. Uma'aseh Rav Kazeh, and such a factual report about great rabbis, who Siyu Agadol brings great support. Al kol ha'amur beforash le'el v'dai bazeh. And that's enough. Okay, I'll stop here. About 2 minutes past time, and I'll stop the screen share. Right, and I suppose if there's any questions or comments.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Incredible to read the words of Hacham that I'd heard so much about, but I'd never actually gotten into and dug myself into a teshuvah of his. I actually first came across Hacham Yisrael Moshe Chazan via the book that Hacham Faul Alav Shalom wrote about him. So fascinating. It brings the man to life when reading the teshuvah. So thank you for that. I do know that it's 11:35 p.m. for you in Israel right now. So I'll just take one question because it's quite late for you. If anybody's got a question, please.
Take a couple of questions, no problem.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions. If anyone has anything, please do unmute and go ahead. Nobody. That's usually a sign that it was all clear and understood.
Well, everybody is in a state of shock.
Indeed. It's a reaction we usually get at the end of our chaburot. Nobody? No question there. Well, I have one actually. So it just means that I get to ask a question for once. Who did we see in Hacham Yisrael Moshe Chazan's period in 19th century that you would say is of his ilk, of his type, of his kind? Was he a standout? Was he somebody that was very unique in his approach, or do we see it as being, just another chain, if you like, a link, if you like, in that chain, and there were others like him at the time?
Obviously, if he was a sort of run-of-the-mill rabbi of the mid-19th century, I don't think it would be so unexpected or striking to see what he writes here. So obviously he was an outstanding and both unusually erudite, because you see when he's quoting, he brings in from different teshuvot, and he brings in from Moreh HaNevuchim and the commentary on Moreh HaNevuchim, and he brings in various ways of understanding the Sifra and the Merkevet HaMishneh Ashkenazi, who himself was very interested in general studies and who quotes this person who was formerly one of the Anusim and knew Greek and Latin and could interpret what does it mean, theater and circus and so on. So to put together all of these sources in one teshuvah and construct a very well thought out logical progression of how to make a certain general claim about the relationship between human nature, Jewish nature, human nature, Goyish nature, and how this all connects, and when it's appropriate and when it's not appropriate. Okay, so this is unusually, to my mind, unusually impressive teshuvah. That being said, there were other rabbis at the time, well, certainly in Italy and also in other places who, on the one hand, very much appreciated what he wrote. And I think I've mentioned in a previous context that when the whole idea of music and the importance of music, and in Livorno, right, there was a school of sacred music established by Jews, in which musical composition and so on and so on was taught in an orderly way. So this type of attitude was not something absolutely unique, although, as I said, at the same time, I think he was an outstanding example of this type of Torah attitude.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got a question here from Albert Hassan, a great question. He says, so dress and tunes, they seem to be okay to follow the social norms. What are the limits? At what point do we say not to follow the local standards? It sounds like a shaila.
Well, first of all, I'm not a rabbi, so I don't have to answer that. And if somebody in the vein of Yisrael Moshe Chazan was to try to answer that, he would say, well, a lot depends on the context and the sensibilities and the cultural involvement of the Jews. Certainly, a priori, we are not called upon, according to this way of looking at things, to adopt a priori a negative attitude. Because the Goyim do it, because it's non-Jewish, then we should have no part or interest or involvement with that. Okay? That certainly doesn't fit. Now, when and what would be appropriate in different situations, this is something which I think would be up to the specific rabbi, the specific congregation in a specific context to make that decision, and no such decision could probably be made once and for all, right? The people came from Spain, Christian Spain, to North Africa. The cultural context changed. What's appropriate in Bet Knesset changed. So when we make these kind of decisions, it's not a once and for all decision, but as he said, adin mishtaneh lefi hamakom v'hazman, and this makes things more complicated, but more interesting.
Yeah, because I think even if we're using tunes, for example, for religious purposes, Albert just mentioned, I mean, when I used to have I still enjoy listening to different recitations, whether it's Christian recitation, Quranic recitation, and I can't seem to differentiate between some Mizrahi tunes and classical Quranic recitations. It's very, very, very hard to distinguish the two. It's just the language is different, but the tunes are so similar. So even in the realm of religious borrowing, it seems to have trampled, if you like, or it's gone into that realm. So to try and determine the limit, I remember Avi actually a few months ago, we were talking about, is there a song in Gibraltar or Morocco that's sung that you said, that you were telling me about, Avi?
In Morocco, the Andalusian musical scale in Morocco is common to the high musical culture of the Moroccan Islamic elite and the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them recognize this. This comes from the original context of Andalusia, right? And I think they have the whole thing. Originally, there were 24 nubot, each one appropriate different hour of the day. But some of them were lost. But the Jews preserved more of them than the Muslims in Morocco did. And So yes, this is
Yeah. Avi, do you remember the one in particular that you were telling me about?
Yeah, I think the Kiesh Mena Shabbat, which is very popular, I think worldwide now. That tune is quite popular tune in Morocco. So I'm sure there's many
Do you want to
examples.
give us a rendition, Avi?
Oh, wow. Kiesh Mena Shabbat, El Yishmerani. Yeah.
That one, very popular. There you go. Margaret, I see your hand up. You're muted though.
This was all very fascinating. I'm sorry I was late. Many, many years ago, there was a rededication or something going on in Lauderdale Road. I think it was a Hanukkah something, and I attended it with a friend of mine, and they started to sing Adon Olam, and he said, this is a typical tune of the Lauderdale Synagogue. I said, it's not, it's Judas Maccabeus. And that was a prime example of this Handel writing this great music. And it was Adon Olam, Hashem Malach, it's Judas Maccabeus. So it's interchanged a lot. And I loved what the professor said. It's so interesting of how used for the good and the positive, or where to draw the line. Fascinating. Thank you. Agreed.
It reminds me of when I was in my anti-anything influencing Judaism days, when I went to Rabbi Dweck and said, the dreidel, why do we use the dreidel? It's like some pagan thing, surely. Well, what is this thing? And he said, when we acculturate something, where we bring it in and assimilate it for a positive purpose, context is key, as we heard the Rav say at the beginning when he shared some words. Context is key. There is no such thing that has inherent context. And the professor has clearly shown that today in the words of Hacham Yisrael Moshe Chazan. Professor, thank you so much. Everybody else, thank you all for being here.
Sometimes in order to preserve the identity of the Jewish prayer, there is a modern trend among Chazanim to take modern Israeli tunes and to bring that to the prayer. And I think that's wrong, because you don't concentrate on the prayer. Your mind is wandering to the modern, like there were songs of the 6-Day War which they used to put into Adon Olam, which fits in, or in Kelokenu, which fits into absolutely anything. And it's wrong, because your mind is not focused where it should be. It goes elsewhere. So my thought.
It's a fair point. Indeed.
I will mention in this context that, there's two traditions of bakashot, which are early Saturday morning in the winter. So there's one in Morocco which follows the Andalusian tradition, and there's one which is, I know very little about this, but there's one which is associated with Halab, with Halabim, and later it came to Jerusalem, and so on. And it was instituted in Halab around the year 1800, specifically to attract young Jewish men away from popular Arabic music, which usually took place in venues which were considered culturally inappropriate, coffee houses and so on and so forth. And they intentionally used, the rabbis, they wrote piyutim, intentionally used the popular music of the Syrian, Turkish popular music for bakashot. And it's written in the prayer book, this bakasha is according to this tune, and the original tune has nothing to do with Bet Knesset, but everybody knew it.
There you go. And it reminds me reading about the last point, reading about the piyutim of Hachmei Sefarad in a book by Jacob Schachter. And he said that all the beautiful poets that we have today would never have existed if it wasn't for the Islamic poetry of the time that influenced the Hachamim to model their piyutim upon. So just goes to show, if we take things for the good and bring it in and change the context and give it it reminds me of the line from Rav Kafach that anything that's done to know God is holy. There is no distinction between holy and secular if the entity is being used for holy purposes. So on that note, thank you so much, Professor Zohar. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We can't wait for the new series to begin during membership mode. Everyone, whoever's not signed up, make sure you do. We've got a fantastic series with the professor. And I hope you and the family are safe, Professor. Our thoughts and prayers are with you and everybody there. And looking forward to seeing you soon. Good night, everybody. Good day wherever you are, and catch you next week. Thank you.
Chodek Tov. Chag
Chazak
Sameach.